Elisabeth Mandala's case is one of those tragic and unsettling stories that lingers in the memory not only because of its brutality but because of the unanswered questions and the lack of closure it brought to those who knew her and to the wider public who later read about it. She was only 18 years old, a young woman from Sugar Land, Texas, described by those who knew her as vibrant, outgoing, and adventurous. She had just graduated from Kempner High School in Fort Bend County and had enrolled in Houston Community College. Friends and acquaintances would later recall her ambition and her adventurous streak, qualities that seemed to drive her both academically and personally. Yet these same traits also played a role in the circumstances that led to her being found dead in a foreign country under mysterious conditions. In late April 2010, Elisabeth decided to travel south across the border into Mexico, a decision that would prove to be fateful. At the time, Mexico was experiencing waves of violence tied to organized crime, drug cartels, and territorial disputes. The region where she was ultimately found, Nuevo León, was one of the areas heavily impacted by cartel violence and clashes with security forces. Her decision to go there was never fully explained in any official account, but those who later investigated suggested that she may have been lured by promises of opportunity, adventure, or possibly even money. Elisabeth had worked part-time in different jobs back home, but like many young people her age, she was also looking for excitement, independence, and perhaps a taste of something beyond the suburban environment she grew up in. The news of her death broke in May 2010 when Mexican authorities discovered a truck abandoned in a rural area in the state of Nuevo León. Inside the vehicle were 3 bodies, all of whom had been brutally killed. Elisabeth's body was among them. She was accompanied by 2 unidentified Mexican men, believed to have connections to organized crime or possibly to smuggling activities. The vehicle itself showed signs of violence, and all 3 victims had been killed in a manner consistent with cartel-related executions. What was shocking to many was how Elisabeth, a young American woman, had ended up in such a dangerous and hostile situation so far from home. Investigators in Mexico immediately took jurisdiction over the case. Their focus was primarily on the 2 men who were killed alongside Elisabeth, as the modus operandi suggested that this was not an isolated crime of passion or a random act, but rather something tied to larger criminal networks operating in the region. Mexican authorities speculated that the men were involved with cartel activities, and that Elisabeth may have been traveling with them either voluntarily or under coercion. Some reports indicated that she may have met individuals online or through acquaintances who promised her opportunities for quick financial gain. Others suggested she may have been deceived or misled about the true nature of the trip. Back in Sugar Land, the news devastated her family and friends. She was remembered as a bright and ambitious teenager who was still figuring out her path in life. For her family, the shock was compounded by the fact that U.S. authorities could do little. Because the crime had occurred in Mexico, jurisdiction lay entirely with Mexican law enforcement. The U.S. consulate assisted in repatriating her body and in communicating with the family, but beyond that, the investigation was firmly in Mexican hands. The FBI briefly looked into whether there was any cross-border element that could bring it into U.S. jurisdiction, but ultimately closed its involvement after determining it was not a domestic case. The lack of progress in the investigation was another source of frustration. Mexican authorities, facing thousands of homicides linked to organized crime each year, had limited resources and often prioritized cases connected to ongoing cartel wars over foreign victims. Elisabeth's murder quickly became one of many unsolved cases. The circumstances of the 2 men found dead with her suggested that the intended targets of the attack were likely them, not her, though her presence complicated the case. Whether she was collateral damage, a witness eliminated because she knew too much, or an unwitting participant caught in events beyond her control, remains unknown. The wider context of 2010 cannot be ignored in analyzing this case. Mexico was in the throes of escalating cartel violence. President Felipe Calderón's government had launched a military-led offensive against drug cartels in 2006, and by 2010, the situation had spiraled into unprecedented levels of bloodshed. Nuevo León, where Elisabeth was found, was a contested territory at the time, with the Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas battling for dominance. The region saw daily killings, kidnappings, and attacks on both rivals and civilians. This environment made it extraordinarily difficult for law enforcement to piece together individual crimes. Bodies were often found in abandoned vehicles or dumped in public areas, intended as messages between rival groups. Elisabeth's case highlights not only the violence but also the vulnerability of individuals who, knowingly or unknowingly, become entangled in environments dominated by organized crime. Her youth and her status as an American citizen made her death especially newsworthy, but in the broader context of Mexico's drug war, her case was one of thousands, and the investigative system was overwhelmed. Even for cases involving U.S. citizens, there was often little resolution. Families back in the U.S. faced the grim reality that their loved ones' killers might never be identified or prosecuted. Some theories emerged among those following the case. One was that Elisabeth had become romantically involved with someone tied to criminal groups, and that she was traveling with him when they were ambushed. Another was that she may have been recruited, knowingly or unknowingly, as a courier or mule, as cartels often lured young people with promises of quick money. Yet another theory suggested she may have been kidnapped or manipulated into the situation. None of these theories could be confirmed because of the lack of witnesses, forensic follow-up, and coordinated binational investigation. For her family in Sugar Land, the tragedy was compounded by the uncertainty. Without clear answers, they were left to grieve in a state of limbo. Publicly, they focused on remembering Elisabeth's personality, her dreams, and her warmth. She had been described as someone who loved adventure and who had a spark that made her stand out. Friends from high school recalled her energy and her tendency to seek experiences beyond the ordinary. In that sense, her decision to travel to Mexico reflected a consistent trait in her character. Unfortunately, it also placed her in an environment where her youth and inexperience may have left her vulnerable to manipulation and danger. In analyzing this case, one cannot ignore the structural issues at play. The U.S. and Mexico have long struggled with how to handle crimes involving American citizens on Mexican soil. The U.S. can advocate for justice, but sovereignty limits its ability to intervene. Meanwhile, Mexico's law enforcement and judicial systems have historically faced problems of corruption, inefficiency, and intimidation by cartels. Witnesses are often too afraid to come forward, evidence disappears, and cases stall. Elisabeth's murder fell into this pattern. Her case may have received headlines initially, but as weeks and months passed without developments, it faded from the news cycle, joining the countless unsolved murders of that era. Another element to consider is the social dimension. Cases like Elisabeth's often spark debate about youth, risk-taking behavior, and the lure of danger. Some critics argue that she had been reckless to travel to Mexico at such a volatile time, particularly into areas known for violence. Others countered that she was a victim who had been deceived and whose life was cut short before she could fully understand the risks. In truth, the dynamics of youth, ambition, and naivety played a role. Many 18-year-olds feel invincible, driven by curiosity and a desire for independence, not fully appreciating the dangers in unfamiliar environments. The brutality of the way she was killed also underscores how merciless the environment was. In cartel-related killings, there is little regard for collateral damage. Innocent bystanders, family members, and even children have often been targeted or killed simply because of proximity. Elisabeth, whether willingly or unwillingly, ended up close enough to individuals tied to dangerous activities that she suffered the same fate as them. This reflects the indiscriminate nature of the violence. Over a decade later, Elisabeth's case remains unresolved. It symbolizes both the personal tragedy of a young life cut short and the systemic failure of justice in the face of overwhelming violence. It also serves as a cautionary tale for those who underestimate the dangers of crossing into regions plagued by organized crime. Yet at the same time, reducing her story to a mere warning overlooks her humanity. She was more than just a victim of circumstance. She was a young woman with dreams, relationships, and a life ahead of her. Her story also touches on the cross-border relationship between the U.S. and Mexico. Despite the close economic and social ties, the two countries often struggle with trust and cooperation in law enforcement matters. Cases involving U.S. citizens in Mexico expose the limitations of that relationship. Families often call for greater involvement by the U.S. government, but sovereignty issues prevent deeper intervention. Meanwhile, Mexico, grappling with its own internal crisis, frequently fails to deliver justice. Elizabeth's family thus found themselves trapped between two systems, neither of which could give them the answers they deserved. In reflecting on her case, it is important to consider not only the immediate circumstances of her death but also the broader context. Her life intersected with a moment in history when Mexico's excessive violence was at some of its worst levels. The state of Nuevo León would eventually experience a period of extreme brutality as cartels fought for dominance. The environment was one where even locals were not safe, let alone foreign visitors unfamiliar with the landscape. For Elisabeth, stepping into that environment meant stepping into a storm she could not possibly navigate. The haunting aspect of her story lies in the unknowns. Did she understand the risks of the people she was with? Was she actively involved in something illegal, or was she simply caught in the wrong place at the wrong time? Was she manipulated by individuals who saw her youth and foreign status as exploitable? These questions remain unanswered, and without answers, her death becomes not only a tragedy, but also a mystery. Ultimately, the story of Elisabeth Mandala reflects the collision of innocence with brutality, of youthful ambition with a world of violence she could not control. It reminds us of the dangers that exist in certain environments, of the limits of law enforcement across borders, and of the enduring pain left behind when justice is absent. For those who knew her, she will always be remembered not as a statistic of cartel violence, but as a young woman with a smile, with dreams, with potential that will never be realized. For those who study or reflect on her case, she stands as a reminder of how vulnerable individuals can be when caught between personal choices and forces far larger than themselves. In the years since her death, her name occasionally resurfaces in discussions about unsolved cases, U.S. citizens killed abroad, or the dangers of cartel violence. Yet her story, like many others, risks fading into obscurity. To truly honor her memory, it is important to keep telling it, to acknowledge both the personal tragedy and the systemic issues it reveals. By doing so, one can hope to shed light not only on her case, but on the countless others that remain unresolved, each representing a life lost, a family grieving, and a justice system unable to provide closure. Elisabeth Mandala's case remains emblematic of the violence that plagued Mexico in 2010, and of the vulnerabilities young people face when stepping into unfamiliar worlds. It is a story of a girl who sought adventure but encountered danger, of a family who sought justice but encountered silence, and of a society that continues to grapple with violence that leaves far too many questions unanswered. In the end, her memory lives on not only in the hearts of her loved ones, but also as a symbol of the human cost of violence that knows no borders, no age, and no mercy.